Thank you for joining us. My name, if you all don't know me, is Bridget Maloney, and I am Communications Director at Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. We are the statewide nonprofit working to end the death penalty in Florida through legislative advocacy, direct action, and public education. We are very grateful to be co-hosting tonight's conversation with Light After Life, a new organization focused on justice reform, rooted in restoration and accountability. You will hear more about that soon because one of our panelists leads that organization. And I am seeing another one of our panelists, Wright, coming in now. So I am going to let him in so that he can join us. And there we go. Perfect timing, Ron.
It's working finally.
Perfect. That's okay. We were all here waiting. I was just riffing a little bit. So I'm just doing my introduction and then I'll introduce all of you and we'll get started. Can you hear okay?
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am. I got my headset on here.
Perfect. Okay. So across the United States, veterans are nearly twice as likely as non-veterans to become involved in the criminal legal system, often facing some of the harshest sentences available under the law. In Florida alone, more than 4,000 veterans are incarcerated. This number is likely undercounted because veteran status has to be self-reported. As we've seen in our work, the consequences of this can be very extreme. Florida has executed more veterans than almost every other state, and veterans remain overrepresented on our state's death row. Tonight, we are here to ask a difficult but necessary question. What does justice look like when the system fails to understand trauma, moral injury, and the invisible wounds of war? Hence the title, Weight of War. I'm very pleased to be joined by three of my favorite people, but also people with very unique experiences in both, they are veterans, and in the criminal legal system. And so I will start with the wonderful Captain Art Cody, who's retired from the U.S. Navy. I hesitate to say retired because it feels like he's still there. He is the director of the Center for Veteran Criminal Advocacy. Art served more than 30 years in the military, including aboard the USS Enterprise in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and as staff director of the Rule of Law section at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. Did I pronounce that right?
It goes both ways, but Kabul or Kabul, either one's good.
Perfect. As a civilian attorney, Art has represented capital clients for more than 25 years and has served as lead counsel in veteran clemency proceedings. He frequently advises lawyers nationwide on defending veterans facing capital prosecution and other crimes. Next, I'm going to go to Sergeant Ralph Ron Wright Jr., an amazing member of FADP's board and Florida's 27th death row exoneree. Ron was an Air Force sergeant and Orange County deputy sheriff who spent 3 years on Florida's death row for a crime he did not commit. Ron is a former Orange County Sheriff's deputy with an unblemished record and a proud veteran of 22 years in the Air Force when he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in 2007. There was no forensic evidence, weapon, cell records, or any testimony incriminating Ron. The prosecution's key piece of evidence was one glove of the same kind issued to Ron's military unit. However, analysts were uncertain if it ever came from Ron's base. DNA tests on the glove run by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement showed no definitive match for Ron. An independent analysis by labs hired by both the defense and prosecution excluded Ron. He was convicted solely on the basis of potential motive and opportunity. A jury voted 7-5 to recommend Ron for the death penalty. In 2017, the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, the Florida Supreme Court unanimously overturned his conviction and ordered a directed verdict of acquittal, freeing him from death row, and he has been with us and in the movement ever since. And over to Seaman Christina Kate, who is a U.S. Coast Guard veteran and justice advocate. She is the co-founder with Tara, who is also here, and head of policy and public affairs for Light After Life Florida. And if you don't know them, you should go and type it into Google right now and go and find them and follow them on everything because they are amazing. They are a new faith-rooted, family-led advocacy movement. They focus on advancing justice reform through restoration, accountability, and meaningful second chances. Their work, and Christina's work specifically, is on strengthening the connection between community voices and organized advocacy to address the long-term impacts of incarceration, including through legislative advocacy. And my very first question, oh, and I'm Bridget. I told you who I was, but I am only here to moderate tonight. I know many of you are probably used to me yapping, which you can see us do tomorrow on the vigil, which hopefully does not happen, for Melvin Trotter beginning at 5 p.m. You can find that on our website. And if you would like to hear from me, you can hear from me then. Otherwise, I'm just here to be with our wonderful guests and ask them a few questions that we came up with and that we got community responses for. So with that, my first question is for Captain Art, Cody, and Christina. I believe Art was going to answer first. So Art, when someone enters the courtroom carrying PTSD, moral injury, or other service-related trauma rooted in service, how should that change the way responsibility and culpability are evaluated? Where is the system getting it wrong?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to think about with respect to any capital defendant, going back to in the 70s with Furman versus Georgia and Gregg versus Georgia, one of the big principles Supreme Court talked about was that we only execute the worst of the worst, and also that every individual who's coming up for a potential capital sentence is evaluated on the whole of their life. And I think what we see happening in veteran capital cases, and not just in capital cases, but in every veteran's case, but it's most pronounced in capital cases, is there's just a fundamental misunderstanding about what veterans go through and how they got to be in the place they are, which should inform whether or not they're death eligible or not. And I think what happens is we are not fully appreciating that our veterans are are categorically different, particularly our combat veterans are categorically different than those who have not served in the military, particularly those not served in combat. And the way I like to think about this is that your average person who is in Jacksonville or Fort Lauderdale or wherever is probably not, or probably has never been worried about, hey, I wonder if the road is going to be loaded with IEDs, with improvised explosives devices today. I wonder if I'm going to get shot at today. I wonder if someone who's wearing a uniform that's supposed to be friendly is going to engage me. And that experience is foreign. And that experience is something that molds and shapes the minds of our vets. And I think in particular, something when we talk about culpability, we know for a fact when we send our troops overseas to either Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, wherever, we know for an absolute fact that not all of them are going to come, all of them come back changed. But we know that for a significant number of them, they will be changed irreparably. And that will be the result of trauma, which will result in post-traumatic stress issues. It could be traumatic brain injury, a variety of different things. But I think what's happening is there's not a full appreciation of that in the criminal justice system. And part of that is because only 6% or so of the US population are veterans. And it's not only that it's a small percentage, but for those who are veterans, it's not just a job. It is an identity. It is who they are and what they've been through. And so you're asking essentially the rest of the population who is not familiar with the jargon, the nuance, all the different things in the military. You're asking them essentially to sit in judgment of people whose life is all entwined in this. And for the smaller percentage, that is the 6%, it may be a small percentage, but the military makes up so much of their life. And it's had such an effect upon them, particularly if they're combat veterans, that I think that's where we're really, not to use a nautical term, but that's where we're missing the boat. And there is just there's a lack of awareness of what they went through. And I think in particular, when we talk about culpability, I mean, some of the culpability is on us as a society, because we know when we send people off to war, and this is not news. This has been going on since the Odyssey, the Civil War, Revolutionary War, you name it. So long as there's been war, people have not come back okay. And so we know that. Um, so so essentially what's happening in our court is there's not a full recognition that they are less culpable than someone who's not had the same experience that they've had.
Well, that was, of course, not surprisingly an excellent and insightful answer. And I think, yes, the total, and that's why we wanted you all here, is that many of us are not veterans. And I think if we can start to understand or at least listen to those who have been through it, we can start to be better advocates. And Christina, I know I asked you the same
Yep.
question. Did you want me to repeat any of it, or are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. So one things that I do notice is whenever they're in a courtroom, they look specifically just at the crime they're in there for. They don't look at, their service. They don't look at what they did in the service or anything like that. They specifically only focus on the crime, and they almost view anything outside of that as like an excuse when it's not. I know from my experience of going to boot camp, their job is to break you down completely so that they can mold you into what they need you to become. I know I I was in the Coast Guard, but I still had to go into war zones with a ship. But it's something we still had to do. So we had to go through a lot of traumatic type of training that changes you. And I do know of a case specifically where an individual um, needed help. He was having mental health issues. He was aware of them. He went to the VA. He went to the one in Tampa twice, one in Georgia, and then flew to Nevada. All of them did not give him what he needed, and he kept having blackouts, and a crime was committed. Even though all that was presented, that didn't matter. They still said it was your responsibility to get help, even though the veteran did attempt it. So I think one thing we need, that I'm trying to advocate for, is we do need people in the justice community that are veteran focused. Like they have that expertise, they have that knowledge, so that we don't just look at that. Because I do know also, whenever there's a mistake made, whether it's in a courtroom or a lawyer, one of the things they do is they look at the mistake and then they backtrack it to see where it went wrong. But we don't do that with the cases. So if someone commits a crime, we don't look at, well, what happened before that? We're just going to look at this moment. We're not going to look at anything else. And we're doing them a disservice. I mean, they sacrificed their lives for us. They come home with wounds to protect us, and then this is how we take care of them, and it's not okay, and that's a big change that we need to make.
To follow up on Christina's point, I think part of the issue too is that we haven't done a good enough job of bringing in experts or people who can talk to juries, prosecutors, etc., about the veteran experience. We almost treat it as like, well, it's kind of like a government sanctioned gang. It's not the kind of thing, but the experience is so much more immersive than that. And so what I see, particularly when I do appellate work, I see that the veterans, because the lawyers they're good people, but the lawyers are just not educated enough and they're not experienced enough. They don't speak the language in order to convey what the veteran went through. And I think this lack of education, which is part of the big gap between the civilian population and the military population, is a big part of why that message isn't getting delivered. And it particularly needs to be delivered at the very early stages of the case. Because I think commonly, if the prosecution cannot, particularly, and I'm talking in a capital case, if the prosecution can understand what this individual went through, we can get death off the table.
Well, that's excellent, and not excellent, but anybody who has heard me speak before, each of the veterans cases that I've seen at FADP are not people who did not try to get help repeatedly, and that goes for veterans and not veterans. Most experiences that I've seen, it is someone who desperately sought help and didn't receive it, and that seems something that we can work on as well before an injustice, that the original crime happens. And just an injustice alone of our soldiers not receiving the help that they rightfully deserve and that we give them. And Ron knows that I'm coming to him next. And are you ready for me, Sergeant?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Perfect. So, Ron, you served your country for 22 years, and then you spent 3 years on Florida's death row for a crime you did not commit. And now you're here with FADP, and we are incredibly grateful. At what points in your case did your veteran status matter, and where did it fail to matter?
It did not matter. The prosecutor spent a considerable amount of time, if anything, pretty much discrediting me. I mean, he actually took the time with other military members on the witness stand, just going down the list. He didn't do this. He didn't work in this kind of unit. He never did this. He didn't have anything to do that. He didn't do this. And he basically saying he was a nobody that wore a uniform. And the truth of the matter is, the attitude of the prosecution, mind you, they want to win. That's their supreme goal in that courtroom, is we don't care who you are, where you came from, what you did, how many little old ladies you helped across the street. We're going to hold you responsible, and the process of crucifying you is on.
Well, that is excellent, and part of why Ron is one of my favorite humans. It just always surprises me how someone who has served their country for so long and law enforcement for so long could be convicted and sentenced to death. And I just want to note, and I'll thank all of our panelists later, but these people, all of them, have continued their service, whether it be Art as a lawyer and Ron, and if I were Ron, I would be running far, far away from this place. You have something to add, Ron?
Yeah, real quick, one thing that did happen at one point during my trial, there was a period of time where this prosecutor was just ripping into me, berating to me, because mind you, there was no evidence in my case at all, no evidence of guilt whatsoever. So their strategy was basically crucify me so the jury will hate me and use everything they can to get all the emotions and everything else out of them, directed toward me in order to secure a conviction. But at one point, my attorney objected to all this ripping into me, and they had a sidebar, and I stayed at the table. And after that, this prosecutor, and I almost started to feel sorry for him, because he had to actually walk back over to the jury box and walk back all that he just said. Mr. Wright, he's not a convicted criminal. He's not ever been in any trouble. He's got no criminal history whatsoever. He's never, all that stuff. And I looked at my lawyer sitting next to me, and I says, it feels like it really killed him to have to stand in front of that jury and admit, I'm not a bad guy. I've got no criminal history. I'm not this antichrist incarnate here, And I almost felt sorry for him, because I feel like to the jury, he was now discrediting himself, which, you don't want anybody, the feeling of embarrassment or whatever. I just said all this stuff. It ain't true. I'm full of hot air and crap. I didn't mean it, whatever. But that actually happened during the course of my trial.
And as a reminder to everybody, Ron was sentenced by a 7-5 vote for death, which even in Florida, which has the lowest standard at 8-4, to sentence to death, would not be a death sentence anywhere in the entire country. So that means that even given everything that Ron just shared, 5 people still wanted him to live, and that today in Florida would have been a life sentence. So thank you so much, Ron, for sharing that, and of course for being such a big part of FADP. And I am going to go back to Christina, and I would love to shift toward like potential solutions for a very complex problem. And that's something that we're trying to do as well, is sort of put all of the pieces together and see, we know it can't just begin at a death warrant or even at a crime, right? It has to be before that. So Light After Life has proposed legislation that would allow for a second look sentencing hearing for veterans. Can you please explain what that legislation would do and why it's necessary?
Yes. So this legislation took me a while to draft and write up. So I did not take this lightly. I had a lot of different meetings between defense attorneys, veteran attorneys, you name it. I did it. And I looked at what would work, what would not work. And in order to get this legislation even looked at, I had to also kind of do research on Florida because this is a very particular beast, meaning it's not like some other states. So I knew I couldn't just, write a bill as if I was writing it like for, Illinois, for example, which they're a little bit more pro-reform. So I had to write it in a language where our lawmakers would be willing to sponsor it. So, what this legislation is one thing that we have learned with data and research is veterans that do have any type of, wound from the military, prison actually makes them worse. It makes them even worse when they get out. So, the argument that Florida uses for public safety is actually the opposite. By incarcerating them with these long sentences, they are actually making the community less safe. So what this bill is they would be released, but it would be on what we call house arrest. Now, I know we don't want house arrest, but the reason I did that was for the specific reason is that is the only way Florida would allow a bill like this. So it's a sacrifice that families may have to make because it does cost money to have someone on house arrest. But it's it's kind of like, weighing out, do we want them home or not? And then by them being able to be on house arrest at home, they can then, if they need to see a therapist, addiction, therapy, whatever the wound is, they can get that because right now in our prisons, that doesn't exist. So they might have meds, but there's no treatment. So all they do is deteriorate and get worse. So being able to do this second look would give them a chance to actually rehabilitate and get better. And that's the whole goal. And the matter of fact is a lot of I know Florida likes to try to pass laws that are not for violent offenses, but a lot of veterans do have violent offenses, not because they're malicious or anything like that. It's because of their wounds. And we have a lot of people that have PTSD who black out or do stuff in their sleep. And it's not an equal thing. And I will say, the one senator that we've been talking to, Carlos Smith, he's one of the ones that is going to be sponsoring the bill, for 2027. So hoping, I'm excited about it and hoping with whoever the new governor is that he'll see how important this is for Florida and we can get it passed. And then maybe we can get some of the veterans home, and get them in treatment and we can show them how Florida can be compassionate and be, create safe communities.
I think that's excellent. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that legislation introduced. I think it's extremely important. And I relate to what you said too about sort of house arrest, FADP, we say, no, use life without parole instead. And that's not because we're necessarily championing life without parole. I know our former executive director, Mark, is here. So I will call on him. Not really. Don't worry, Mark, to say that we, stop the killing first, we get them out of the system, we get them help, we worry about that other stuff sort of down the line. And while this was going to be a follow-up for Christina, she did sort of mention it. So I wanted to point toward both, surprise, to Art and Ron, and just sort of in your experience, Ron, with seeing cases over time, can you talk a little bit about that growth that people can have while incarcerated, and why that might matter? Or even on the flip side, if you see, lack of growth and lack of support making somebody maybe even worse off?
I think one of the biggest things that affects somebody while they're on death row is, first of all, the fact that it's hard to put this in words because it's hard to describe the kind of hope and despair and wishing and praying and all of that that goes on, at least for those that are paying attention to their situation. But the biggest thing is you got to remember, when you're incarcerated, you're isolated. You're cut off from contact with everybody except those folks beside around you and the officers or whoever that comes in there on the road at any time. But I think that for the most part, there's different types of inmates on the road because you've got different types of the elements of people on the street. And honestly speaking, a lot of people in there, like Richard Pryor said, thank God we got penitentiaries. And some people, you think, okay, and I've met a couple guys in there. They've been up there for 25 years at the point of which I arrived. And I found them to be very decent people. I think that, their crimes happened long ago. Maybe they have been rehabilitated and have atoned for their crimes. And if I were to be asked if I wanted them back out on the street, yeah, I would have no problem with them being my neighbor. But then there are the ones who simply don't get it yet. They don't understand. They have no idea the gravity of the situation they're in. They don't understand the legal system. They don't understand anything going on in the courtroom. They don't even have concept of mind of what I can do to help my own lawyer help me. And one of the things I often harped on with a lot of guys, every time somebody would want to ask me a question is, what are you really doing to help out your case? Because you have to remember, your attorney has how many cases, but you only have one case. And what are you doing for it? Nobody in that courtroom was there when the crime occurred. Nobody in that courtroom was wherever you were if you're innocent and knew that you weren't there committing the crime. But how do they know that to be able to articulate a defense with that in court without your help? Nobody can say where I am and what I'm doing better than I can and how to best prove that and find evidence of it. But see, a lot of these guys that they're not thinking about that. It's not just another world, it's a whole nother culture behind those walls. Mm-hmm. And living on death row, it's like, for some of us like me, what in the world am I doing in here with these people? Oh my God, what's wrong with this idiot? And then for other people, it's the hustle, the game, they say trying to survive or, coping with everyday, occurrences that come at you. And all of this other stuff, I don't think they have the time and space of mind to even think about it, to really, be able to understand, just what their situation really is.
Thank you, Ron. And as we are talking about Florida cases, and I'm gonna go to Captain Cody first, but a context for everybody, the capital punishment context, obviously. A 2025 Death Penalty Information Center report, Forgotten Service Lasting Wounds, confirms that veterans are overrepresented on death row, especially in Florida. Our state has sentenced at least 117 veterans to death, more than any other state, and accounting for 15% of the total last year. Last year, Florida executed 7 veterans, more than any other state. 3 were in a row. Captain Cody, I know because you and I had the pleasure or displeasure, it was wonderful to work with you, but given the circumstances, on several of those cases, and I'm sure that picking up on what Ron just mentioned about sort of not being able to really understand your situation. Can you share anything that stood out to you about some of those cases from last year?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that always kind of hit me was that these folks never should have been there. They shouldn't have been on death row to start with, for a variety of different reasons. But I think one of the big ones, and this does kind of go back to my opening remarks, and it's that there was a lack of recognition of the different level of culpability, the different mental state that the veterans have. And I suppose one of the ones I think of in particular is Jeff Hutchinson. The crime that is absolutely horrific, and no doubt. We should throw numbers at it. It's four dead. That's a lot. Okay. However, you have to go to really evaluate whether this is the kind of person you want on death row. You got to look at the entirety of his past and the entirety of his mental state. And I think the thing that struck me about him and other people on the row as well is that other veterans on the row is that there should be, and this goes along, I think, what Christina was talking about, there should be a categorical exemption for veterans. And I kind of narrow a little bit because I know sometimes you have to narrow it to get it passed, but um, one of the things we suggested during that era when there were the multiple vet executions in a row was we suggested to the legislature and to the governor that veterans, because of what they have gone through, are very much like other groups that have been categorically excluded from the death penalty. For example, you can't in the United States, you can't execute someone who's less than 18 at the time of their crime. You also can't execute people who are intellectually disabled. And the thing is, just as there is an exemption for them based on a decreased culpability, there's also a decreased culpability for the people that we executed last year because of their backgrounds. And that just to me that was hammered into me looking at what they had been through, and in some cases um, what their mental state was.
That's a wonderful answer. And Ron, I had a question for you that you sort of answered earlier, so I'm gonna shift it up a little bit. I just keep throwing
Sure.
fun ones at Ron. Um, you have had the experience of being in the military and on death row innocent, which is really, a very unique situation. And how do you square being able to let me see. How do you square being able to advocate for an end to the death penalty, fully, but for veterans and why veterans shouldn't receive the death penalty, even though you, a veteran, did? Can you share just a little bit about what kind of compels you to continue doing this work? Even though you weren't somebody who did actually commit the crime, you recognize that those exemptions and like what Christina and Art had talked about, certainly that would have saved you at the time, but it also would have, saved an innocent person. So I'm just wondering what you think about why your reasons are for continuing to advocate for something like that, even though you were innocent and could, leave us all in the dust.
Well, it's really very simple. I learned what I didn't know. One thing I often share with people when I do speaking events is how, as a police officer, my job was to respond to the calls for service, investigate what's going on, and take the appropriate action. Um, I wasn't one of those types of cops that followed up on how many convictions and cases I handled were secured or how many years were were handed down in sentences or whatever. Literally, if I didn't get called to testify in court in something, my involvement in a case essentially ended the moment I cleared central booking because I'm back out on the street to answer the next call. So I was really never for or against the death penalty. It wasn't, I was that person, like I say, the victim of the, ignorance. I wasn't aware of it. I knew there was a death sentence in Florida or the death penalty in Florida, and I knew somebody could be sentenced to death, but I was that other, completely clueless person that sees the big, headline story on the 6 o'clock news. And by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, I ain't got a clue. I'm not, I'm, off in 1,000 different directions again. But having been dropped right into the middle of that pressure cooker, I've been enlightened. I've been educated. I now see things that I didn't have an opinion of one way or the other because I just didn't know it. I didn't understand it. Um, I'll share with you guys a couple of things that I experienced in my 8.5 years of incarceration. And that has to do with what I saw in, well, two cases, two things. There are people on death row who were already in prison serving a life sentence. They wanted out of that life sentence so bad, they eventually found a way out, and the way out was the death penalty. And what I'm saying here is this whole ultimate punishment thing that is really a fallacy because people don't know what life in prison is like. Um, they wanted out of that life sentence and knew that with the death sentence, their time is now finite, and when that day comes, it's over for them. So do whatever you want. You can't do no more to me after that. The other thing was an inmate that I was in a housing pod with while I was in the Pinellas County Jail, who actually committed the first and only homicide to ever occur in a Pinellas County Jail in that housing pod I was in. And he did that and he made it known to everybody. He did not want to do life. He didn't want to get life. So his plan was to murder his cellmate, who both of them had just met that day, just moved into that housing pod that very day. And it was in an effort to force the court to impose a death sentence, the state to seek, and the court to impose a death sentence because he didn't want to get life. And I think, oh, it's so hard to squeeze so much of this in such short time, but it's just so saddening and disheartening and disappointing that the way things are happening in the courtroom, so much of the story isn't being told. So much of the truth people don't know. People are completely unaware of. I myself would have never imagined that somebody who's in prison already with the life sentence, albeit, would actually go to the lengths to commit another murder while incarcerated to get to the death penalty. And there was one inmate that I was like two doors down from. This guy, and this is so strange. He was one of those doing a life sentence. He murders another inmate right there at Florida State Prison, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He tells you flat out. After he did it, they walked down to the quarterdeck and told the officers, "We need to cuff up. There's a dead body up there." The thing that was so interesting about him was he went out of his way to try and expedite his execution. He went pro se during his whole trial, and I watched his oral arguments with the Florida Supreme Court. They gave this guy credit for how well he appeal proofed his case. He didn't want any other capital regional counsel or any of that. He didn't want anything. He wanted to be executed and get it over with. And it went so far to the extent that, I don't know if y'all remember, but Florida put executions on hold when they were debating and arguing over the drugs being used in lethal injection. Well, this guy knows that they still have old Sparky up there. It is maintained, they test it, and he has the right to choose that as his method of execution. So he held a press conference to announce he's choosing old Sparky as his method of execution just to delay anything from keeping it happening. And he told a prosecutor in one of his court hearings not to slow walk him on this because he wouldn't be responsible for what may happen if they start playing those games with him. So what I'm getting at here is there's just so much, and it's hard to get into some of these other guys' heads, but all this stuff I've learned, the people I've met, the things I've been through, and what I'm learning now, it's the reason I go out and talk about these things because I know there's a lot of other people don't know, not just about my case. I'd never been in jail before, but oh, what I know about being in jail now. So there's just so much more to the story that just is not adequately being told and expressed and shared with people. And a lot of it is a lot that's very difficult for other people who've never been in there to comprehend because well they're not of that mindset, that's not the mentality they have, that any of that would even register with them. But that's really why I do this. I learned, I found out, and it's there's so much more to this that time fails us to ever adequately express it to anyone.
Thank you so much for that, Ron. And I completely agree. It seems like Florida is just creating more murderers, creating more death, creating more victims. I don't see any parts of this process that is definitely dignifying anyone's life that's involved. So that, I think that that is really an important point to make, which is that, the state is in fact likely keeping us unsafe, and it's exactly what Christina said as well, in incarceration. And I've seen some of that, where people are incarcerated for a short amount of time and come out a completely different person, and then or at a young age, and then they come out and they do the crime that ends them on death row. And it makes you wonder, perhaps if you didn't sentence someone to prison for 30 years for a nonviolent robbery, they wouldn't come out a completely different person. So I appreciate you saying that. And I know I promised everybody that I was going to keep us right brief. But as everybody who knows about me, a brief is not my strong suit. But I do have a final question for all of you. And I know there are questions in the chat, but this is a rapid fire lightning round for you each. And I'm going to go with Art, Christina, and then Ron. What does accountability with dignity look like for veterans who have caused harm? And how can we, all of us, move closer to that vision? If accountability does not have to mean execution or even a life sentence, maybe it means house arrest or 25 years, what does accountability with dignity for veterans look like? And what do you think? I know this is a big ask, but what do you think is something we could do to start to build a system that really reflects that?
You want me back? You want me to lead off? Okay. I think in most cases, the ones I'm involved in, we don't really use the veteran's background as a defense. It's much more of a mitigator. Because if you legally, were they of a legal right mind when they commit the crime? Did they know what they were doing? Did they know it was wrong? Most of the time, the answer to that is yes. However, if we're talking about accountability with dignity, it is a recognition that even though they made this awful, terrible decision, they are not they're not the worst of the worst. And they almost by definition, they cannot be the worst of the worst because of what we asked them to do and the result that we knew would occur. And I think one of the ways we need to change that is a much better education system. And really, we need to start with defense counsel. Defense counsel understanding what veterans have been through. So it's not that, well, Judge, he's a vet. It's got to be better than that. They deserve better than that.
And before Christina goes, Art has said previously is that they can't be the worst of the worst because at one point they were the best of the best. And for that remains true for veterans or not veterans, which is that the entire picture of someone's life really does matter. And it, particularly in veteran cases, it shouldn't just be considered as an excuse or a mitigating factor. It should be considered something much larger than that, similar to what Art said about intellectual disability and age, because they're put in a situation that our country put them in, and they often return with wounds that they didn't have before they went. That's why they were able to be so successful. And I'm so grateful to have learned so much about that from Art. And I also want to say it's incredibly important to say that, and they're going to say it, that no one is asking for a free card. No one is asking a get free, get out of jail, get out of whatever. We are asking for, reasonable steps at each juncture, to, to ensure that actually the harm stops happening to both the veterans, the victims, our larger community. And exactly what Art said and what you are all saying in the chat is that being here and hearing these voices and learning these things makes all of us better advocates, and better, better situated to talk about these. And so with that, Christina, same to you.
Okay. So I think one of the hard parts with the accountability aspect is that in our court system, we have a lot of bias. I know most of my conversations with advocacy and arguments have been that, oh, well, that's just an excuse because they're a veteran. And that's not what we're trying to say. We're not trying to say an excuse. We're trying to help you understand how this happened. And from the majority of the veterans that I have communicated with, they are all very remorseful, and that's a really big difference when you are separating all the different people that are incarcerated. A lot of them, like when they find out what they did, they're like they're in their own kind of shock because of what happened. And a lot of times they'll be upset too, like, I tried to do this, I tried to do that. Why didn't anyone listen to me? And these are things that potentially could have been avoided if, when they go to get help, they listen to it. And then the other thing that I hear a lot is once they're incarcerated, they usually, own up to what happened, but then they're like, they're not helping me though. Like, I'm not getting any help. And they have expressed that they're scared. Like, what if I get out and it happens again? Because all I'm doing is sitting here. I'm taking meds, but that's it. That's completely it. And what I think a lot of people also forget is a lot of veterans that do have disability compensation, if they get incarcerated, they lose all that. And that's a big problem too, because unlike what a lot of people believe, prison is not free. It's not all paid by the taxpayers. Some people will have a bill that are incarcerated. So I think a lot of them do have accountability, but the system that we have makes it hard for them to have accountability because they're labeling them or they're putting a bias on them without actually knowing them or even listening to them.
Excellent. And Ron, in case you also got distracted by their wonderful answers, the question was basically, accountability with dignity. You talked about accountability. You were an officer. You were someone who was innocent. And so, we do talk about accountability, but what does that look like? Particularly in veterans cases, what would be a really good first step into that besides just harsh sentences and execution?
Well, I believe this is a twofold answer. On one hand, we have to codify some of this in the law. What's in the law is what the courts have to follow. So we're going to have to fight that incredibly uphill battle of how to put this in the law, because the next step or the other side of this is the word discretion, because it's at the discretion of the person who's weighing these factors and these mitigators and aggravators, and they're basing how they, what they decide on how they feel. I know that for the judges, when they were the ones doing that, there is no guideline that I'm aware of that says how much weight any particular type or certain factor must be given. And there's a lot of people, that, and it's important to understand where the opposition's position comes from, those that advocate for the death penalty and not wanting anybody getting any, help or any consideration. They're coming from a place of anger, a place of pain, a place of hate. And that whole eye for an eye thing is pretty much all they see. That's their whole space, their whole existence. So if we can't put this into law that basically mandates what gives, what doesn't give, and take the discretion factor out of it, then we're back where we started, because if this judge didn't care, didn't feel like it, or this is a highly publicized case or a politically charged case, then that discretion is going to, it's everything, nothing's going to matter. So I think that's really what we're up against here. We need to get this codified in the law, and it's got to tie the hands of the court, that cannot be ignored. And only until we do that, what's happening today, Steve Harvey said, we keep doing what we've been doing, we're going to keep getting what we've been getting.
Mm-hmm.
And-
Love Steve Harvey.
Yeah, that is excellent. And I actually, for everybody to have context on that, there is no uniform way of weighting mitigating factors in Florida's death penalty scheme. So, and that includes a jury would never weight it anyway. So the judge looks at the proposed mitigators and the proposed aggravators and gives each a weight. And actually, I have had a pipe dream that Ron has now sparked again. Of a law review article, because I have come across some cases, they don't even weigh them the same scale. So you would think like little weight, medium weight, great weight. No, it's every single, sometimes I've seen tiny weight. I am not kidding, little bit of weight. And besides that, it's, I fell off of a building when he was 3. Tiny bit of weight could be one case, literally. And in another case, was a good person in school, which is great. I love when people are great in school. And then it's like very great weight, so not only do they not have a scheme where they're saying, okay, if you fall off a building, that's great weight, or if you are in combat, that is great weight. We've seen veterans cases where it's little weight, itty bitty weight, or some medium weight. And Grace is right about sentencing schemes generally. So I think, that in combination with the categorical ban, which is, very, very new, the U.S. Supreme Court, and I'll have Art back to talk about Porter at some point in the future, because I just love talking about that case and how meaningful it is. But that kind of categorical ban, what Christina was talking about, and their legislation, that I hope all of you follow them, so that we can continue championing good stuff like that. And what Ron said too about, and what many of our people have said in the chat about where it starts, and receiving that help. I know we don't all work for the VA, so that's, we're not going to be able to always go and support, but now you have, 3 more resources and other people. There are plenty of people in this movement otherwise who are more than willing to share about their experience. And it is our duty, I really believe, as advocates, as supporters of ending the death penalty, to really understand what that means. And I also want to kind of, just for myself, we have gotten sometimes, well, we trained them to kill. And when I hear that, it's kind of like that, yes, but they were trained to protect our country. So I just want to kind of dispel this, every single veteran is violent for violence purposes, or that, this is something that we own because we made them go and do this. It's, yes, we made them go and do this. And this is me, a non-veteran, saying this. But what more importantly, we didn't give them the resources there or when they returned to try to get better. Art and I have talked about, we had one case where someone was in the military, I think for 5 years, like significant drug use in those 5 years, continued to serve, like, and then just was released. Never a treatment for drugs, went in there. And that's not to disparage the military or even the VA. I think just showing that there are so many parts of this system, like we don't need to just hang all of our hats, or whatever the saying is, on just ending the death penalty entirely or ending it for vets entirely. There are a lot of ways to make a difference, and I know that the panelists agree. Do any of you want to say anything else before I close? And then I will tell my panelists something. I mean, my visitors, our guests. Yes, Ron.
Just wanted to add, when it comes to doing the weighing of the aggravators and mitigators and the weight that's being given to them, if you recall, the judge had the judge doing that here in Florida. And then the Supreme Court came down in Hearst and said, no, 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 no. The jury's got to do that. So now you got to get these 12 people to understand, come together and apply, the weighing factors to these things. And then, and this is what, the veteran is up against. Then you move out there into the court of public opinion where, oh my God, are we ever going to agree on anything? We can't get 435 members of Congress in DC to agree on stuff. The rest of, and this is where our jurors come from. So just another insight to, how you're that small grain of sand up against that mountain of boulders,
That's excellent. Art, Christina?
I think my last takeaway is just with the new legislation that we have coming out, if it's something that you think you want to support, I encourage you to contact whoever the chair is for the Criminal Justice Committee when it does come out, because that person decides what bills are going to get heard. So even though it's sponsored, doesn't mean it'll get heard. And the more people that contact them and say, we want this bill passed, then it'll increase the likelihood that he'll have to put the bill out to be heard.
Art, have you said enough? Or
I think I have said enough for once, yes.
Oh, excellent. Me too. But if people do, you missed it in the beginning, but if people do want to hear more of this, tomorrow we will be hosting a vigil for Melvin Trotter, who is scheduled to be executed at 6 p.m. He is not a veteran, but it is very important that we talk about it anyway, not just so that you can come and hear me, obviously, but please try to join us online at 5 p.m. if you are able, or at the prison at 6 p.m. Ron, forgive me, are you going to be at the prison tomorrow or next week?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, next week I won't be in
Perfect.
Florida, so yeah.
Well, even better. So Ron will be there tomorrow at FSP, which means even if you can't be there, you can join online and catch him. And each one of the people on this panel is an inspiration to me, including many of the attendees. I am seeing all of your questions. I don't want to keep anyone past the hour, but if anyone knows me, they know I cannot tell a lie. So this has been recorded. And when I send out the recording, I will make sure that I pose these questions to our panelists, and I will send out answers with the recording to everyone. And I just volunteered our panelists to do that, but I'm sure that they'll be more than willing to agree. And I just want to remind everyone that our state does not need this for accountability. That shows it today. And I also hope that people leave this feeling hopeful, knowing that each of our panelists and everyone that is here has suffered and gone through their own struggles, just as we all have. I mean, we're not all veterans. And they, on the other side of that, continue to advocate and continue to be a part of this. And that is really meaningful to me. And I think our entire situation in Florida, we're all exhausted and discouraged and broken in a lot of ways, but there is hope, and this is just one part of that hope. And so I'm really grateful to our panelists. I am definitely going to drag them in again for something else, and a few plugs. You can catch Ron with us at www.fadp.org. He is also with Witness to Innocence, an amazing organization run by my brother, who's not a veteran and not my brother, but Herman Lindsay, another death row exoneree. Christina, please find her and her wonderful co-founder, Tara. And Art is always around and is always, in my experience, willing to talk to just about anybody in the world about anything, just like me. So with that, I think,
Encourage everybody. I'm sorry. Get signed up for the FADP newsletter or go to the FADP website, because the number one hurdle our society is up against is the lack of awareness. So to keep up with, things going on in Tallahassee and legislative changes, we don't just, send out newsletters and talk about death warrants that have been signed or executions that have been scheduled. When some of these pieces of legislation that is being sponsored up there, We also talk about its impacts and the pros and cons, and we need people to be more aware and more understanding of what's going on because they're informed. So by all means, if you don't, get your information from the news, the FADP newsletter and website is another good source. I mean, I travel for a living now in the transportation business. I find out what's going on in Florida through a talk radio station I listen to on the iHeartRadio app all over the country.
Brilliant. And much of our material comes from the people that you see on this panel. So, don't think it's just us. And I'm so grateful to all the guests, grateful for the panelists for staying on longer than I told them that they would. But I know Grace will be pleased that I was still very efficient. And with that, we are going to close this out. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here.